Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, the STRESS webinar, Strategic Resilience Assessments, Applying a Resilience Lens to Development Strategies and Programs. ACCCRN is very happy to have you in the discussion today. As you may already know, ACCCRN is a leading regional network connecting professionals and communities across Asia to build inclusive urban climate change resilience. We deliver our value through amplifying the local voices, facilitating collaboration among practitioners, supporting local community initiatives for resilience, and connecting practitioners, community, government officials, and the private sector to join hands in building urban resilience. We hope everyone will gain benefit from the webinar, treating this as a learning platform to exchange ideas and experiences to promote cross-learning among individuals and groups. So I am Yoga, Member Relations Manager for ACCCRN Network. Before I pass this to the moderator to start the discussion, I will explain the webinar ground rules. So general participants will be muted during the presentations, so the share audio feature will not be available for you, but only available for the presenter and the moderator. But the participants can access the chat feature if you want to ask questions. If there are urgent inquiry, you can use the raise hand feature or chat feature. And presenters are allowed to use presentation materials to display. Moderators may have certain methods on the discussion, including the Q&A session that will be explained further. And the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to ACCCRN's website soon. Once again, thank you for joining. Now we shall start the webinar, and I will allow the moderator to speak. Ratri Sutato, the time is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. If you can't hear me, because sometimes it happens, just text something on the chat box and then I will try to resolve the issue. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Ratri Sutarto. I am the director for the ACCCRN network. And for this opportunity, I'm happy to introduce Olga Petryniak, which is our regional resilience director. She will be presenting a methodology on strategic resilience assessment that has been implemented in several countries in Asia by Mercy Corps. Before I start, I'm just going to give you a brief summary of Olga. She is a resilience specialist with 15 years work experience in natural resources management, conflict management, legal protections, governance, disaster risk management, and climate change adaptations. She is currently the Director for Regional Resilience for Mercy Corps, supporting resilience initiatives across the organization's South and East Asia program portfolio. So as you may know from the information that we shared about this webinar, this is a strategy, this is a methodology to create a long-term program design that helps program teams, practitioners, and other relevant stakeholders to build an understanding of the dynamic social, ecological, and economic system in which communities are embedded. STRESS employs system thinking to understand how disturbance and development constraint contribute to changes that affect development outcomes for people and communities. And in Asia, Mercy Corps has applied the STRESS methodology in various programs with different characteristics in Nepal, China, Myanmar, Mongolia, and India. And for this webinar, Olga will share that experience and then explain to you what STRESS is all about. And so, as mentioned by Yoga, if you have any questions, once the chat box is available to you, you can post your questions in the chat box, and then I will write them down. And then once Olga finished with the presentations, I will post the questions to her, and then she will answer it in 2 questions at a time. And if you can't hear or if there's any problem during the presentations, just let me know through the chat box as well. I'll be monitoring it every time. So with this, I would like to allow Olga to start the introductions and the presentations on the STRESS methodology for Mercy Corps. Olga, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Ratri, and thanks everyone for having me this afternoon and for joining. I'm really looking forward to sharing a bit with you about Mercy Corps' process for how we integrate resilience into development programs and strategies. across our work and to see if this methodology is useful to you. I will say I've asked Ratri to jump in if I'm speaking too fast. If you can't hear me, if there are any problems, as I cannot pay attention to the chat box given the way I'm scrolling the slides. So Ratri, if you need to interrupt, please do. And I'll just dig in. So this particular session is organized into 3 parts. So first, in order to help us understand the stress process and its application, we do all need to be on the same page about what we mean by resilience. And I know many of you on this webinar are real experts in this field, but I wanted to take you through the conceptual framework that stress is anchored in, because I do think it's important to understand the process and just so that we're on the same page. Second, I will provide us with an overview of stress and the methodology, and finally share some examples of its application. There will be a lot of content, a lot of theory. This will take about 30 minutes. If you have a lot of questions, I can also share resources with you after the session. So let's dig right in. So let's start by gaining a common understanding of what we mean by resilience. And we like to do it by taking a look at these 2 graphs. So the one on the left represents sort of traditional development and thinking and practice, if you will, be it by government or development aid agencies. Basically, based on our understanding of a particular context and needs, we might prioritize a range of investments that, after a sustained period of time, we expect would lead to some sort of improved well-being outcomes, whether that's more incomes, more jobs, kind of businesses that are stronger. It can be a whole range of outcomes that we determine are important. But increasingly, we are forced to reckon with the fact that reality looks a lot more like the graph on the right, where climatic events, natural disasters, in some places conflict, food price shocks, a range of shocks and stresses repeatedly hit us and reverse those development gains, putting us sort of on a backward pathway. So, what is resilience? Resilience is essentially the ability of people to manage those shocks or stresses, whether it's by households, by individuals, communities, businesses, governments. Managing those shocks and stresses at whatever level or scale is necessary to ensure that we minimize any potential negative impact and that we're able to recover and get back up on that development pathway. Or perhaps, if we really build resilience, in some cases, we are able to avoid the shock or any negative impact altogether to maintain the development trajectory. Oops, sorry. Sensitive screen there. So with that big picture framing in mind, where do we start and how do we build resilience? So looking at most definitions of resilience, we can break them down into 4 major elements. And in Mercy Corps, we like to use some questions as a starting point to help us think about resilience program design. First, we like to ask, resilience for whom? Who are the specific individuals, households, communities, or groups of people that we want to ensure are? And we need to be specific.
Sorry, we lost your voice.
Oh.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Okay. Am I okay?
Yes, you're okay now.
A little bit closer. So I'm going to start at this slide again and just say that with the big picture framing in mind, it's useful to think about some guiding questions to help us begin thinking about how do we break down resilience in a particular context, and how do we begin to engage in sort of a program design or a strategy. So first, we can ask ourselves, resilience for whom? Who are the specific individuals, households, or group of people that we want to ensure are resilient? Then we can ask of what? And here we start to think about systems. political, or economic systems that people are embedded in, that themselves must be resilient or supportive of resilience so that people can stay on that development track. Then we ask ourselves, resilience to what? What are the shocks and stresses that affect the systems and the people, those hazards that we're trying to protect ourselves from? And a fourth critical question, and here is really what our programming is about and what our programming comes into play, is when we ask ourselves, resilience through what? What are the capacities or the abilities that are required to make sure that people can be resilient? And there is a fifth and final critical question. We're to understand that resilience is not an end goal in itself, but a pathway to well-being. So we have to be clear about what well-being outcomes are we trying to support. And these can be different in different contexts. They might be different for rural and urban areas. And sometimes these well-being outcomes or these impacts are themselves reinforcing. But when we think about resilience strategy and development programming, we need to be very clear about that final outcome that we're trying to support. Is it income stability and growth? Are we trying to protect employment in cities? Do we want to make sure that services for populations are protected? That we have to answer in order to be strategic and specific. So I wanted to go back quickly to this idea of a resilience capacity that I mentioned when we think about resilience through what and what defines a resilience capacity. Now, in this context, we're talking about something. Oh, I'm sorry. I realized I just skipped a slide. So I'll go back. Sorry, guys, my computer is going a little bit nuts, so I'll slow down, and this is the next slide. So considering those 5 questions that I mentioned, we can pull it all together into a conceptual framework that helps us understand resilience. So here, hopefully, all of you can see the pointer. We start with thinking about resilience for whom, or the target groups that we're interested in. We start to analyze and think about the systems or contexts that they're embedded in. We look at the shocks and stresses that affect that context and those populations. And based on the resilience capacities that they have, we can understand whether their development trajectory and whether after a shock hits them, they would collapse, they would be worse off, or whether they would actually bounce back or potentially even bounce back better and recover to a better state than they were before. Now, I wanted to pause quickly on this idea of resilience capacities, because when I talk about the strategic resilience assessment process, this is really what we focus on in that process. So when we think about resilience capacities, this is where we're talking about the ability of people, of communities or systems to achieve those well-being development outcomes in the face of shocks and stresses. And here we're talking about capacities much more broadly than when we just think of a skill set or someone's ability to do something. When we talk about resilience capacities, what we're talking about is resources, social, human resources, natural resources, financial resources, and strategies, how those resources are applied to either help us prevent risk, mitigate risk, or to be able to respond and recover quickly. So these resources can be anything from, for example, financial services or emergency savings that people use to recover quickly from a shock, or loans that are used to adapt a livelihood strategy or a business so that it can be adapted, for example, to climate change projections. And importantly, in order to think about a resilience capacity and understand how it's different from something normal that we do in development, we have to be very specific in understanding how it's used to help mitigate risk, what shocks and stress it's used against, who are the groups, individuals, or institutions that are using that capacity and how, and importantly, who's providing that services? What systems is it coming from? Who or which systems are enabling people to use that particular capacity? So again, if you think about something like insurance or people's ability to access finance to protect themselves from disasters, we have to think about which system is that coming from and what needs to be happening in that system so people can effectively access and use that capacity. And just as a final note, it's important to consider that resilience capacities can be at different levels. So individuals can have certain capacities like their knowledge. Households can have different capacities like their access to certain kind of livelihoods. Communities can have capacities like, for example, their ability to manage their natural resources, communal resources. And we can think of urban systems capacities like broad governance systems or infrastructure. So these capacities can be layered and nested. Well, that's enough for resilience theory, but this is really foundational and fundamental to understand stress. And I build resilience strategy and program design. So what is a stress? So the stress process is a strategic level assessment that helps us understand risks, the drivers of risks, and required capacities to build resilience in a given context. Importantly, it helps us develop effective, measurable resilience building strategies. And it considers the complex interactions that exist between risks, people, and these social, political, ecological, economic systems in which people live and are embedded. And importantly, the stress process is anchored in the 5 resilience questions. Context. Some of the unique features about a stress test is, as I mentioned, it is systems focused. So it tries to break down and understands the systems in a particular context and understand the connections between them. And we'll go into some examples a little bit later. It is also sector neutral. So it doesn't just look at climate change. It doesn't just look at economics. It doesn't just look at the political environment or health systems or educations. It really tries to understand the connections between them and across them. Stress also happens at multiple scales. So again, we recognize that the resilience of a particular urban neighborhood or a particular community is embedded in much higher levels in a city, which might be embedded in a watershed basin, which might be larger topography or country, and we have to understand the relationships between that. And we also have to understand the relationships of these factors across multiple time frames. What's also unique about a stress is that it really gives us that analysis of risk and risk profiles that I mentioned and resilience capacities. There are 4 phases of a stress process. We start with a scoping phase, then we move to inform, then analyze, and finally a strategizing process where we really develop those resilience strategies and a measurable theory of change for resilience. And I just wanted to take you through those 4 phases quickly before we get into examples. So phase 1 is the scoping phase. And this is really a process where we bring in knowledge experts and multiple stakeholders to sort of pull together the existing knowledge on a particular topic that we have. And it's a time where it's also important to determine the purpose, the scope, and the scale of the assessment. So for example, when we talk about purpose, are we using this to build an urban resilience strategy jointly with government stakeholders? Are we using the stress to put out a call for proposals? Are we using this process as an inception phase to start up a large multi-sector program? The purpose of the assessment is very important because it also determines its scope and scale. When we talk about scope, we have to think about what is the well-being outcomes that we're building the resilience strategy around? What is the development outcome that we're seeking? And this is very important, again, because otherwise resilience can become, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, kind of all-encompassing and about everything. So when we start thinking about the specific development outcome that we're trying to protect, whether in an urban area or a rural village, we can start to narrow the stress process a little bit. And then we have to think about scale. Are we interested in a particular neighborhood? Do we want to look at a whole city? Do we want to look at a particular watershed or river basin? Are we interested in a country level strategy? Do we want to understand transboundary systems? For example, how things happening in China are affecting resilience in pockets of Southeast Asia. We really have to think about what scale we're looking at when we think about stress, and that will help us set the parameters of the assessment. Then we bring together our teams, expert knowledge, and joint stakeholders to conduct a systems mapping. And this systems mapping is really essential to stress, as it helps us start to understand the development challenges we're facing, as well as how shocks and stresses or hazards are affecting them, and how jointly these start to affect our development impacts. We identify knowledge gaps, and we prepare a data collection plan to fill knowledge gaps. And what I wanted to do to help you guys understand the scoping phase is just to run through quickly, a systems map. And this is a very high-level systems map, but this would be something that you would do jointly as part of a multi-stakeholder process and people that you would bring in. So let's walk through it slowly. And I give you a couple examples, one rural and one urban. But take, for example, the issue of food security in Nepal. Imagine that what we're trying to do is protect food security as a development outcome. So what we want to understand, in first just understanding the development challenges, is how food security is influenced by, for example, farm production, incomes, and household food consumption practices. So food availability, access, and how food is utilized. Then we can ask ourselves, how do agricultural markets and labor markets and entrepreneurship, financial services options, how do these factors affect people's income sources and therefore their ability to buy food? Or how does finance and income influence farming techniques and therefore farm production that also influences water availability? We can think about how water availability affects people's food consumption practices and therefore food utilization. We can think about how finance, food, and water are affected by things like gender norms and who controls what resources. And again, how do government regulations affect employment opportunities and markets that influence incomes, food security, farm production, etc.? So again, the scoping process would allow us to understand first these initial development relationships and challenges. Into this, as part of the systems mapping, we would identify and start to understand how a range of shocks and stresses affect this development context. For example, we can map how excess rain due to climate change begins to cause floods, and how floods jointly with drought begin to affect farm production, which affects income in current years. But we know that also declining farm production drives a degradation of land and water availability that also affect income in future years. And that we know when communities are hit with a loss of harvest or access to food, they start to engage in emergency borrowing, which increases their debt load, which further reduces their income. And these factors themselves are exacerbated by things like food price shocks and even conflict, which is driven by a lack of land and water. So here we start to understand how a number of different shocks and stresses interact with the food production system, and how this drives this debt cycle here that you see at the bottom, which contributes to people exiting the rural farming system or migrating from stress and then moving into urban areas. And we can understand these same issues or these same complex relationships as part of the scoping stage in urban systems as well. I'm looking for my notes slide. So for example, consider how government priorities and practices influence urban planning and development. which puts pressure on infrastructure and services and often drives the conversion of marginal land, making cities more susceptible to flooding, coastal storms, and a range of climatic hazards. Government priorities and practices also influence business income and investment, which drives a labor pool, determines migrant income, and interacts with this migration coming from rural areas that I mentioned. That frequent rural migration puts increased pressure on infrastructure and services again. It again drives marginal land conversion and further makes urban areas more susceptible to these climatic shocks. And of course, this is a very general map, and there's a lot of detail in different contexts that we can unpack behind each of these squares. But this is exactly what the stress process is designed to do and to help us understand. So the main outputs of the scoping stage are a preliminary systems analysis that defines the interactions between these development constraints, shocks and stresses, and their impacts on different groups. It also gives us a preliminary understanding of resilience capacities, both the ones that are currently being used and potential ones. And finally, it helps us come up with a plan to gather information around knowledge gaps, information that we don't have, to really better understand what's happening in the system and what are the problems that we need to solve. Next, we move to the inform phase, and I won't spend much time on this because this is really just about using the tools and techniques that you already have in hand to collect the data that you need to fill the knowledge gaps. The important point here is just to remember that it needs to be focused to the information that we don't have, that it has to really fit the purpose, the time, and the scale of the assessment. And that, again, it should start with an understanding of the knowledge that we have from our multi-stakeholder engagement, and it should be anchored first in secondary data review before we start to go into other methods. This is important for the assessment not to take too much time and to be focused on the key issues. Then we go into the analyze phase. And in the analyze phase, we really need some key deliverables here that help us make sense of a lot of this data. So we start to understand the development trends and focus on the systemic relationships, just like those systems maps you saw, but now they would be enriched with much more detailed information. We would look at a risk analysis, so looking at shocks and stresses to the systems and the target populations, the drivers of those shocks and stresses, and the risk profiles of the people that we care about and that we want to target for our programming. And finally, we would come up with a resilience capacity analysis. What are the existing capacities that are working and what's missing? And what are the underlying factors in governance and the enabling environment that are really preventing people or households or communities from accessing and using the resilience capacities they need to protect themselves from shocks and stresses? And the fourth and final phase is around strategizing. So we have all this information, we've analyzed it, great. What does that really mean? Well, here's where we come up with a theory of change, or a sequence and layers of resilience capacity, of how we move from one resilience capacity to another and at what level to secure the development outcomes that we want in the face of shocks and stresses. We develop an M&E framework and develop indicators to really start to be able to measure the theory of change that we came up with. And the deeper we want to go, we can start developing logic chains to really understand how we build each resilience capacities and unlock some of the barriers beneath them. So here are some of the stress deliverables, as I mentioned: risk profiles, resilience capacities, and a theory of change. And I want to now just dig into a few examples that might make this all a little bit more practical. And in about 8 minutes, I can open it up for questions. So the first case is going to be a rural one. I'll do one rural case, one urban case, and one that looks at the connections between urban and rural areas. So the first rural case is from Nepal, where we were implementing a large USAID-funded multi-sector program that addressed food insecurity in some of the most remote parts of the country. This is a part of the country that had 50 to 60% stunting rates. It had an extremely high reliance on agricultural livelihoods. And one of the challenges was that in addition to all the typical kind of challenges of delivering services and markets working, there were major topographic challenges. These were mountainous areas where communities were very far away from each other. And where agricultural livelihoods were really plummeting, and people had to buy really expensive food imports. Because of that, there were high debt rates, and to pay off these debts, there was a lot of migration, up to 3,000 men a day migrating to India and to other parts of the world, the Middle East, in order to be able to pay off their debts and to make sure their families could consume a minimal amount of food. And one important aspect in this area to understand is also there were very strict rules around gender and caste, and around how certain groups, depending on which caste they were part of, how they could behave. And the same for women. There were very tight rules around what decisions women could and couldn't make in the households, where they could go and how they could behave. So this, we analyzed, conducted a systems mapping to understand the food security issues in Nepal. And again, the development outcome was the sustainable food security. We looked at food availability, access, utilization, and the different features of the economic and social and ecological systems that fed into it. There was a much deeper map. This is just an example. And this is an example of the shocks and stresses that we analyzed that affected that development system that we saw. And again, we looked at how one type of shock could contribute for another. So for example, climate variability is a serious stress in this area, as is deforestation. And we analyzed how these contribute to a range of more severe shocks in these areas and how this interacted with the food security system and ultimately led to migration, which was also a major stress on the households, because even though it was a food security a coping strategy, it also really broke up the social fabric of villages, because a lot of men were migrating. A lot of these villages were left with only women. And it really broke up kind of the social cohesion of the areas. So this is just an example of the sort of theory of change and resilience capacities that were identified as a result of the process. And you see some of the typical ones here. So for example, something that was identified was the need for risk-sensitive and nutrition-sensitive agricultural practices. So rather than just saying, well, we need good agricultural practices, we realize that they need to be informed by risk analysis, and the agricultural practice in the areas need to address risk. We also talked about markets that are resilient and risk-informed and responsive to the context in the area, and the need for appropriate financial services and products utilized for risk-reducing investment. And each of these high-level resilience capacities has a more detailed logic chain underneath them that defines how we unlock the barriers to actually get to that resilience capacity. But I also wanted to share some interesting and unique findings that came from the stress process that would not have come out if we tried to do sort of sector-specific analyses. For example, one critical finding was that access to key resources was really not sufficient for resilience in these areas. It was really, really critical to build a knowledge base that helped people to understand how they could use certain resources for resilience. So let me give you an example. We would talk about initially, access to remittances is really critical for resilience in these areas because so many people are migrating. But access to remittances is not enough, or effective ways to get remittances is not enough. We realized that we needed to build capacity in the women who were left behind in how to manage and use those remittances in such a way that they were making more appropriate long-term livelihood choices that managed the climate risks that they faced in those areas. So it wasn't just about accessing those remittances, but again, it was managing them and using them in the face of these various risks, building a knowledge and awareness of the risks that these people faced, and helping them use their financial resources to plan better over the long term. Another interesting finding from this assessment, which we would not have gotten if we didn't take these multi-sectoral integrated approach, is we understood that informal rules or informal norms around gender and caste were a critical barrier to people using and accessing resources for resilience. So again, initially we started with an understanding that, we have to build access to water, but for agriculture or for managing in the face of drought. But we also learned through our resilience assessment and the stress process that, for example, certain castes are not allowed to access water at certain times, or women cannot access water at certain times, or that certain castes are barred from accessing water until other castes have had their fill. And all of a sudden, we started to realize that unless we work on these social norms, these rules, or these belief systems, we will never be able to help people access and use the resources they need for resilience. Similarly, women were barred from household financial decision making. So imagine in a context where people are regularly hit with floods or with landslides, the male migrant is away, but the woman at home is unable to make decisions around how to use financial resources to help the household make better investments for resilience. So again, we realized that an underlying thing we had to work on here was these gender norms. And this is something that came out from understanding these connections between the social, the economic, and the ecological. This was our final theory of change. I won't get into that. It was just an example. So really quickly on an urban example, and this was from CHENNAI, India, where in December 2015, there were floods that displaced displaced 1.8 million people, not $1.8 million, and caused $7 billion in economic losses. Small and medium enterprises, which were really a key feature of this area, they contributed 3% to national GDP. Just SMEs from this one city were severely affected. Their export routes were cut off. They lost employees. And we really wanted to understand the systemic connections between the urban environment and small business resilience in this context. And we had a local partner working on resilience with local and government stakeholders. So we applied this methodology, and here is an example of the systems map that really looked at how businesses were disrupted, how this related to finance, how this related to infrastructure. I won't go into the details. And as a flip, it really mapped the capacities, or what are the different things that needed to happen in the system to allow businesses to recover or to not be as severely affected. So we went from a sort of problem map that included, the problematic features of the environment to a capacities map that really offered the solutions and the connections between the solutions at every level. And just some of the key lessons and how we use them that would not have come out, again, if we didn't take this integrated approach, is that CHENNAI's fragmented institutional infrastructure environment really created the challenges that made these small businesses so vulnerable. And it created a challenges for balancing economic growth with environmental safeguards for these businesses. So there was different institutions responsible for different things, not talking to each other, but that all needed to work interdependently to both protect economic growth and development, but also make sure that that growth was resilient. We also learned that damage and recovery for these businesses was not just dependent on the intensity of the flood, but indeed it was dependent on the enabling environment or the business environment, how businesses could access loans, where they accessed insurance, where they could get information from government on key issues. What were the features that required businesses to register or grow in certain areas? All of these factors impacted business vulnerability as much as the disaster did. And one key challenge was in the financial service environment. And I won't go into the detail, but I will say that the study was used to bring different stakeholders, insurance companies, government, and small businesses to the table to look at long-term financial solutions for resilience for these businesses that were so heavily affected. And this is my final case study really quickly. This was in Mongolia, where we did an analysis for across urban and rural areas. This stress was used for setting a country-level strategy for a new country-level legacy program that we were implementing. We wanted to focus not only on what this program would work on, but also on what, in general, development actors had to work on collectively. And we wanted to understand the dynamics between urban and rural systems, because we understood that Mongolia was changing rapidly. Even though there was a very strong history of herding in the country, there was a real push towards mining growth after the country was democratized in the 80s. After that, there was less of an investment in herding. The country became vulnerable to global commodity prices, and people became pushed out of rural areas or started leaving rural areas and the herding system and started to move to cities. Here is an example of a systems map that looks at the connections between these red diamonds, shocks and stresses, and some of the key development challenges. So just really quickly, a concentration of investment in mining here contributed to an underperforming livestock economy, and also poor government services and regulations in both rural and urban areas. These factors were contributing to poor rural social and economic well-being, driving rapid youth urban migration, contributing to unemployment in urban areas, which created other stresses related to alcoholism and gender-based violence, and a general status of poor urban social and economic well-being. And the urban factors around the poor performing livestock economy were exacerbated by these various climatic factors. Zud, which is a winter blizzard, drought, livestock pest and disease, and rangeland degradation due to too much livestock. So some of the unique features that we learned from this assessment that we would not have learned if we had not done the systemic approach is initially our team thought that the main thing driving people out of the rural livestock system were climatic events. But in fact, we learned that it was actually low services, an underinvestment in the livestock economy, and that youth were no longer attracted and no longer wanted to stay in the rural system and therefore wanted to move to urban areas. And we also learned that there was very poor connections between urban migrants and those left behind in rural areas. And so we learned that balanced growth in Mongolia required a simultaneous investment in urban well-being, but also in getting young people back into the livestock economy, interested in jobs and interested in growth there, so that we could really create a balance between strong and sustainable urban growth and strong and sustainable rural development. So this was the final theory of change that came out. You guys can look at it later when you get the presentation. I won't dig into it in too much detail. And these are some key takeaways from stress, just that it is not so much an assessment approach, not so much a strict methodology, but an assessment approach. It needs to really be fit to size based on your scope and scale and purpose. Systems mapping is really at the heart of this assessment. We really draw on existing knowledge, pull in multiple stakeholders, complement our knowledge base with rapid assessment and research, and develop a final theory of change. And here are some additional resources. These are links to PDFs that you can use to get more information. I know I ran a bit over time, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Olga. That was very interesting, and there's a lot of questions already. So I'm just gonna go straight ahead to the questions. So the first question is saying that there are several ways people use the term of risk. Can you please clarify what risk means in stress methodology? And the second one, questions about, can you please elaborate on the sector neutral aspect? Because when we need to provide attention to a specific sector, then how to use the stress in such scenarios. So I'm going to post the first two questions and you can answer it. And
Ratri, thank you. The first one I didn't hear. They said some word was used many times, and how do we use it in this context? I didn't hear what that word was.
So the first, did you hear the first question?
No, the first one I didn't hear.
Okay, so the first one is, there are several ways people using the term risk. Can you please clarify what risk means in stress methodology? And then the second one is about, can you please elaborate on the sectoral neutral aspect? And when we need to provide attention to a specific sector, then how to use stress in such scenarios?
Great. Okay, thank you for those questions. So risk is used in different ways. I mean, absolutely, I would say that in stress and in the way we think about resilience, we think holistically about the complex risk environment, which means the totality of shocks and stresses that threaten to derail development gains or a development pathway in a given context. When we think about stresses, these aren't just any development problem. So for example, if a place didn't have good access to markets historically, we don't call poor access to markets necessarily a stress, because it's just a development challenge that it's a feature of the environment. But for example, climate change is a slow process, but it is introducing new elements of unpredictability into these already challenging development contexts. And we would call that a stress or a risk, even though it doesn't happen overnight, and it's kind of a slow onset risk. And then there are shocks, which is, you know, the flood, the typhoon, the war breaking out in some scenarios. And that is also another set of risks that we have to consider. And the importance is in stress is that we have to look at the totality of these, whether they are ecological, whether they come through social system, whether we're talking about health and disease, but we ultimately have to narrow our strategy to those risks that we think are the most threatening or the most critical in that context, because we can't always focus on everything. In terms of elaborating on the sector neutral approach, so stress is really anchored in bringing different sector expertise together and understanding the connections between various systems. But inevitably, we will also want to dig into the dynamics within a particular system. So for example, let's say you're very interested in health. It would be critical for you to understand what are the dynamics in the health. Well, first of all, what are the risks within the health system? So potential epidemics, pandemics, etc. But also, what are the challenges that are happening in the health system that are contributing to the risk? But also, what are the challenges in the other systems that are contributing to that risk? So if you're very interested in the health system, you might also need to consider what's happening with land conversion or with water management that is contributing to certain pandemics breaking out. And epidemics breaking out. And so all of a sudden, you need to consult with water engineers and people who are building water infrastructure. You need to interact with consumers and how people are storing and managing water. So the importance of stress is that you are able to hone in on a particular system or sector that you're interested in, and ultimately bring out the work in that sector. But importantly, you need to understand how your success is tied to other sectors. And you need to understand the partnerships that you need to engage in for you to be effective in building resilience. I hope that makes sense.
Great, Olga. So I'm just gonna put on 3 questions now. The first one is only a thought from Sivaranjani. It says that while mapping linkages related to stress or resilience, it will be important to acknowledge that the initial trigger of low water availability or drought is also eventually the consequences of many factors over time. I think this is also something that you just mentioned about the stress of risk.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah. So the question will be, the first question in the session will be like, please let us know where stress methodology works the best. Is it rural, urban, or a mixed area? I personally believe that urban and rural areas are connected, and you cannot tackle one by leaving the others when it comes to planning adaptations or mitigation strategy and policies. Please reflect. Did you get that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you for that comment. And I would absolutely agree that increasingly, and I would say particularly in Asian contexts, we are recognizing that we can't think about rural development and building resilience in rural contexts, and urban development and well-being, and then building resilience of those development goals without understanding the connections between them. And I tried to highlight that a little bit by talking about, the exits from the agricultural systems, the unpreparedness of cities to deal with the influx of urban migrants, the kind of marginal land conversion, and sort of informal neighborhoods. So absolutely, I think that we have to tackle these issues together, particularly if we're really thinking about some of the most vulnerable populations that we want to protect. I will say that it becomes challenging to think about, where are our boundaries? So, if you think about a particular rural village, people from that village might be going to 10 different cities, and those 10 different cities might have different landscapes, different issues, different risks. You might think of a particular city that's receiving migrants from all over. How do you understand those connections? So I think the appropriate thing is to just recognize at what scale you're using the assessment. It does work best at a higher scale. So it's really often meant to understand the macro issues and the macro trends and connections. And then as we go into more in-depth and detailed design, we start to go into those kind of lower level community, village, neighborhood assessments to understand what's happening in very specific areas. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Okay, great. So the next 2 questions will be, can you tell us a bit where depth quantitative information can fit in as support for this methodology of stress? Examples are much appreciated. The second one, can you please let us know where we can find other cases you have been working with? And can you please share the link to read more about?
Yes, sorry, Ratri, remind me the first question real quick.
Can you tell us a bit where depth quantitative information can fit in? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so usually it's best to draw on quantitative information as a source of secondary data. So basically where quantitative studies have already been done and using them as evidence into the systems mapping process. If you have a lot of time and a big budget, and you're really looking at a very broad strategy, you might want to collect quantitative data if there's very specific, you feel certain quantitative information really is going to hone in on areas where you cannot do qualitative information. But I would not say that this is the kind of assessment process where you do kind of a baseline, end line kind of thing. One, there's not enough time, there's usually enough money, and usually we don't need that level of rigor in order to understand these dynamics and these relationships and these trends. Once we, for example, select a certain set of resilience capacities and sort of engage in a program design, we may want to do a baseline to understand specific issues more deeply. But that is once we've already honed in on a larger strategy. So again, mostly I would look at existing published quantitative data and use that to inform the qualitative systems mapping and the qualitative data collection process, and ultimately the analysis. I hope that helps. And in terms of resources, so I put a number of resources up here. There are a number of, there's one more from China that is also up on our website. And we also have a few cases from Africa that you can refer to on the Mercy Corps website. And I think some of these are cross-posted on the ACCCRN website as well.
Right, you can, we will upload everything after the webinar, and then you can also have the link of each of the resources in the ACCCRN website. So the next questions will be, could you explain a bit how you assess the dynamics between system, quantifying the pluses and minuses, and which data do you use? And how do you evaluate the effectiveness of your theory of change elements or resilience strategy? How do you predict or model the change over time as a result of your final plan?
I'll start with the second question first, and I'm afraid you're going to have to repeat the first one. But in terms of the effectiveness of the theory of change, so again, well, one thing I would say is that the theory of change is not just for us, right? This isn't something that's meant to be for a program or for Mercy Corps, but again, something for multiple stakeholders to sort of build consensus around, and something that can help us engage in very strategic partnerships. We do want to have indicators of change, and we do have logical pathways for building each resilience capacity. I don't show you examples here, but essentially for each of those resilience capacities, we do have sort of a process or logical pathway for how we get there. And that logical pathway is mostly monitored through qualitative interviews and a qualitative process. But we do want to make sure that we have indicators at each stage and that we're monitoring change. And if we're not seeing the change that we expect, then we would revisit what we're thinking.
So the first one. Yeah, the first question is, could you explain a bit how you assess the dynamics between system, quantifying the pluses and minuses, and which data do you use?
So I'm not sure that it's so much a science as an art in terms of quantifying. So what we do is we start with, so again, we start with the core development challenge, because if you don't have that main development, I wouldn't say development challenge, the development outcome that you want to protect or that you may want to build, it gets very unwieldy. And then we think about what are the different systems that contribute to that. So often when we're in rural areas, we look at social, ecological, we look at services, and the economic, the markets. If we're in urban areas, the systems start to branch out a little bit more. So the economic looks a bit more complex. We look at infrastructure. Again, we look at the ecological systems. But there might be multiple systems, but all related to that core development challenge. And then we start to think about what are the different elements of that system that we need to function and the problems within it. And so we start to just brainstorm, and then we map sort of the logical chain or the connections between them. So this problem leads to this problem, leads to this problem, leads to a negative outcome in this development challenge. Kind of like I showed you on some of those earlier slides and systems maps. And then again, we introduce the shocks and stresses into that to see where the potential threats are that are exacerbating these issues. And that could include some scenario planning too, right? So there's some very real shocks and stresses that we already know about, and there are some that are a potential threat, and so we can build scenarios and trace how they would impact the system, and therefore what resilience capacities we need to build to address them. We do look at, as you said, a lot of these systems maps have a positive or a negative effect. So sometimes, you know, if you can have a positive relationships between elements, and then the same thing, if it goes bad, it can have negative relationships. So the more income people have, the more they can improve farming techniques, the more that supports the land cultivation practices, that reduces negative effects of flooding, etc. And the same thing can be looked at from a kind of a negative reinforcing standpoint. So I hope that helps a little bit. Ratri, I saw an interesting question around timelines and policy gaps that I wanted to answer quickly. Is that okay? And I think we're out of time, so maybe this might be the last one.
Sure, we have a few more. I think that's going to be the last one. After that, we're going to close the question and answer session.
Okay, let me answer this one, and then I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if people have time. So in terms of timelines, this really can take anywhere from 3 months to 6 months to 9 months. I would say the average for a full process is 6 months, but I really understand the point of urgency, and this has been one of our internal challenges around this. What we're seeing is that the most benefit from the process comes from getting that knowledge and expertise in the room, making sure we do a solid secondary data review before our initial workshops, and already bringing that knowledge into the initial systems maps. So if we have strong knowledge experts and strong people in a well-facilitated process, we can really get to a preliminary theory of change even as part of the scoping. We can build out that systems map and use that for a strong theory of change and to pose some hypotheses around resilience capacities. And then we can start to use that, and then if needed, do a very rapid data collection to fill in knowledge gaps and come back to our theory of change. But I really want to start using this process more and more to really start use the scoping as a basis for action rather than having to wait through all 4 phases. And particularly if we have the right people in the room, that can help a lot. So I hope that helps answer that question.
I guess the next interesting question coming in from Steve asking, like, regarding the cast and water access issues, you said that there were issues you needed to work. Did you mean that you needed to work on your approach to take into account cast issues? Or were you starting from a viewpoint that differential water access depending on caste is unfair, and therefore mean that you needed to work on equity issues? And the last question will be asking for, do you think from your experience in working in various sectors that social factors actually have much impact?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I would say it's both of those in your questions. I mean, it's not like the team wasn't awareness of caste issues, right? These are very prevalent issues in Nepal. But interestingly, just from a resilience perspective, everybody's focus was on, we need to build access to water as a resilience capacity. And then it became less about access to water and more about, well, now we need to actually build how do people use water and manage water in a way that is, considers, low water availability in these areas, declining water tables, these flood drought cycles, etc. So that was one perspective. But then again, even with that, how do you build resilience for population who is fundamentally excluded from accessing water first and does not have decisions around that? And so I don't know if you would call it from an equity perspective, but what we needed to start to work on is sort of like a social dialogue and a social mobilization process to help the community understand how, if a core group from that community is barred from accessing water or doesn't participate in water management, they're going to find different alternatives that could potentially be damaging, and how exclusion ultimately has negative resilience impacts for the whole community. And so we introduced sort of a social dialogue, social awareness raising methodology, while on a practical level continuing to work on these other issues around access to water and better water management. And does it work? I would say yes, it does. And the funny thing is, people talk about these social and governance elements as being very time-taking. And, these are really the underlying critical elements of resilience, right? If we don't work on governance, if we don't work on behavior, social norms, we're never going to get to the access and use issues. And certainly they are time-taking, but once change happens, it really happens in front of your eyes. I've seen it happen in conflict scenarios where people one day are fighting, and then all of a sudden their kids are going to school together. And it's happened before my eyes based on, kind of social dialogue and social behavior change methodology. You see communities where there's high prevalence rates of gender-based violence, to women all of a sudden really taking greater control of household financial decisions. Again, critical for building resilience if we're thinking about how households are making investments over the long term to protect themselves from risks. So, you see, I'm sure many of you have seen examples of policy change. So yes, they're time taking, but then once a decision is made and the government blocks that investor from some kind of investment that could really negatively affect the urban landscape or make it more prone to coastal flooding, you see those things happen quickly. And so I wouldn't pull back on really working on those issues as central to our resilience approach.
Great, thank you, Olga. I know there's still several more questions, but I think the time is already been more than an hour. So if you have more questions, Olga, can we share your contact on this so they can send it to you directly?
Yes, absolutely. I would be happy to answer questions. And again, please look at the resources that are there. And we'll be publishing an updated stress guidelines soon, and I will be happy to share that with you and on the ACCCRN site as well.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, everybody. If you have any questions, we will definitely going to share Olga's email, and then you can shoot email right to her, or you can also send it to ACCCRN at info@accccrn.net, and then we will share the questions to Olga. And then, as Olga mentioned, all the publications and all the information here will be uploaded into the ACCCRN website, and then we will share it with you about a week from now, including the video recording of this webinar. So you can share it with your network.